Welcome back to Accounting Matters. I'm Adam Olsen, Embark's National Head of Practices, and we are entering our final episode of our three-part GRC series. We've talked so far about internal audit and the return on investment with that. We've migrated into a little bit of conversation in our second part around GRC modernization. And today we're diving into what I think is one of the most urgent topics that CFOs and risk leaders are having to think through, and that's navigating the new risk landscape. Allison Bradshaw, a principal here in our Dallas office who leads our GRC services, is back. So welcome, Allison.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be here for the series finale.
Excited to wrap this conversation up, but we've got a lot to unpack in this episode. And Allison, I think if I'm thinking about it holistically here, the risk landscape, right, has fundamentally transformed over the last 3, 4, 5 years, if you really think about it, right? When I talk to CFOs, I'm sure you hear the same thing in your conversations. They're dealing now with risks that weren't even on the radar 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you name it, right? You've got AI systems that are making critical business decisions day to day. You've got sophisticated cyber attacks we read about in the newspaper, I'm just dating myself right there, but in the news. And then complex global supply chains, regulatory requirements that are constantly in flux all the time. You name it, right? There's risks all over the place, and it's a challenge that these risks don't really exist in isolation, right? They're all happening at the same time. They're interconnected in ways that are really hard to predict. Right, like an AR failure can become a compliance issue, which I'm sure you're well aware of. A vendor cybersecurity breach can become your reputational crisis. So how do you even begin to get your arms around all of these different things at once?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Adam. And that interconnection is what makes the modern risk landscape really so challenging. Mm-hmm. The playbook that worked even 5 years ago really doesn't work anymore. Organizations need to be thinking about risk in a much more dynamic, an integrated way. And so they need to be able to move quickly and move fast because these risks are, to your point, constantly evolving, and they aren't waiting really for anyone to catch up.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're going to unpack here today, right? We'll talk about AI governance. How do you oversee something that's moving as fast as it does? Yeah. Cybersecurity and data privacy, like I said, in an increasingly connected world. Third-party risk, when your vendor ecosystem can be hundreds or even thousands of companies deep if you look at some organizations. Sure. And then really how to stay ahead of the regulatory requirements that, like I said, seem to multiply faster than you can implement them. All right, so let's dive into that first topic around AI risks and governance. I think AI is generating, it's fair to say, a lot of anxiety in most companies' boardrooms, right? Every organization is deploying AI in some capacity, whether it's chatbots or used for fraud detection, maybe it's used for pricing decisions, talent and hiring and performance management, all sorts of use cases for why people are using AI. But I'm sure most haven't really thought through what are all the governance implications around AI. Right? There's actually a recognized framework for thinking about this, NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And they published an AI risk management framework that's becoming one of the standards boards as well as auditors are starting to align against. So Allison, when you look at that through a CFO's lens, what are the key risks that rise to the top?
That's exactly the right place to start. The NIST AI Risk Management Framework really defines what trustworthy AI looks like. And when you distill it for a financial leader, 5 risk areas really stand out. The first is data integrity, right? Your AI is really only as good as what you feed it. Incomplete, stale, biased training data really produces flawed outputs, and there are real privacy implications when customer data flows into these systems. We've seen that play out in hiring algorithms that discriminate, pricing models that draw antitrust scrutiny, fraud systems that flag perfectly legitimate transactions. The second is reliability. So does your AI perform consistently? Does it hold up over time? Models drift, right? So what worked at deployment may degrade 6 months later as the world changes and the data it learned from no longer reflects reality.
Yeah, and what's particularly challenging is kind of that black box problem that I feel like you're describing, right? If you can't explain why your AI denied a loan, if you're using it for those purposes, or flagged a certain transaction, that creates both regulatory and reputational risk. Regulators are asking, can you explain how your AI works? And I'd say many organizations can't very well answer the question.
Exactly. So that's our third risk area, really. And that's the explainability and interpretability, which is how NIST frames it.
Okay.
And it's not just a regulatory checkbox. If your AI is making credit decisions, compensation decisions, or claims determinations, and you can't explain the reasoning, you have a governance problem, whether or not a regulator is knocking on your door, right? So the fourth risk area is bias and fairness. So are your AI outputs equitable across different groups of people? So this one gets underestimated because organizations assume that their data is neutral, and it rarely is. And the consequences can be discrimination claims, regulatory fines, reputational damage, and those are all very real consequences.
Okay. And then you mentioned there's a fifth area.
Right. So the last is kind of accountability and transparency. And I think it's the most important one for CFOs specifically.
Okay.
It's about who owns the AI system, what decisions are being made, by whom, with what documentation. And critically, are you reviewing these systems on a regular cadence? AI isn't set it and forget it. You need defined review cycles, audit trails, clear lines of responsibilities. Without that, you don't actually have governance, you just have deployment.
Yeah, and I guess I want to maybe circle back to something that these 5 areas, I imagine, apply differently, kind of depending on what the AI is actually being used for.
Sure.
Right, so like an AI chatbot that's maybe answering customer questions that they have or prompts, it's probably very different than an AI tool that's used to make maybe financial or underwriting decisions for a financial services company. So how do you think about calibrating the governance across different organizations to the stakes that are actually involved?
Sure. So our recommendation is to take a tiered approach. So high-risk AI systems, those significantly impacting individuals or involving regulated activities, need rigorous governance.
Okay.
Human oversight, regular model validation, bias testing, explainability requirements, audit trails. Lower risk systems have lighter governance obligations. So that can include basic monitoring, periodic reviews, clear escalation procedures. You also need policies and controls around AI development, deployment, and monitoring. Who can approve AI projects? What testing is required? What documentation is required? And you need ongoing monitoring because those AI systems drift over time. So the performance can degrade and new biases can develop depending on kind of the information going into the models.
Yeah, and I think maybe the big elephant in the room is the speed at which you do things, right? So organizations are adopting AI quickly because they feel a pressure to, whether it's inherent or they're seeing their competitors do things, you name it. I think there's a real urgency issue around AI. So if I think about the concept of governance, I feel like governance takes time. So how do you actually balance moving fast, but also being thoughtful about the risk?
Yeah, and it takes us back to something we've talked about in previous episodes, right? But it takes a cultural shift. It's risk as an enabler, not as a constraint. And AI governance helps you move fast, safely. And when you have those clear frameworks in place, you can actually accelerate adoption across the organization because you're not making it up as you go. One practical approach to this can be to establish guardrails rather than gates. So instead of a lengthy approval process for every AI project, you can create clear principles for your people to follow and ensure that they stay within those guardrails. So if a project meets those, it can move forward quickly. If it crosses certain risk thresholds, then it does trigger a more rigorous review. And really, when you hear that, right, it kind of follows that this really needs cross-functional ownership, not just IT or legal or even risk. Organizations getting this right really have executive level governance committees with technology, legal, risk, compliance, and business representatives treating AI governance as a strategic priority. And it's not a compliance exercise.
Yeah, well said. Let's maybe shift over to cybersecurity and data privacy, which I think is the risk that keeps probably most CFOs up at night. I think, like I said at the kind of start of the episode here, right? We've seen the headlines out there, major companies suffering ransomware attacks, data breaches exposing customer records or critical infrastructure that's being targeted within an organization. And just like with AI, there's a recognized framework for this, right? NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which I think now is in its second version. And it has become kind of the standard for enterprise cyber risk. So talk to me a bit about how CFOs that are trying to get their arms around this, like, where does their risk conversation start?
Yeah, so cybersecurity risk, I would say, has really become almost existential for many organizations.
Okay.
A major breach really can destroy customer trust. It can result in fines, halt operations in some cases, and sometimes put a company out of business, right? So that threat landscape is more sophisticated than ever. You have nation state actors, organized crime, ransomware as a service, and the attack surface keeps expanding as we move to the cloud, as we interconnect more devices and we enable more remote work. The NIST framework uses a useful lens because its newest function is to govern, right? And that's specifically focused on making cyber risk a leadership responsibility, not just an IT department problem. That's the shift CFOs need to internalize as they think about this.
Yeah, and I think that's what's changed, is that cybersecurity is no longer just an IT issue, right? This is a board level issue,
Absolutely.
an enterprise risk issue, et cetera. And so when I talk to CFOs, and I'm sure when you talk to them, they're being asked by their boards, are we doing enough? How do we compare against our peers? What's our cyber risk exposure? All those types of questions. But I think many CFOs don't have a good framework for answering those questions directly, because cybersecurity can feel very technical or maybe just overwhelming depending on the complexity of the organization as a whole.
Yes, you're right. It really needs to be reframed as enterprise risk, not just an IT issue. And that reframe really starts with understanding those key risk domains. So the first is perimeter and network security, protecting your systems from external threats, right? Firewalls, intrusion detection, vulnerability management. But here's what's changed. The perimeter is gone. So cloud work, remote work, connected supply chain, there's no clean inside and outside anymore. Organizations really have to operate on the assumption that the threats are already inside the walls. Next, I would say, is really identity and access management. So many breaches happen because attackers compromise legitimate credentials. So strong authentication, least privilege access, regular access reviews. These are all critical controls, as you know, right? So this one matters especially to CFOs because finance systems, whether you're talking ERP, treasury, payroll, are very high value targets, and access to those systems is often broader than it should be. Last, I would say, is data protection. So where is your sensitive data? How is it encrypted? Who has access? What happens if it's stolen? Organizations need to know what data they have, classify it by sensitivity, and protect it accordingly.
Yeah, and then I imagine you've also got the human element, right? So phishing, social engineering, those are probably some of the most common entry points for attackers, and that hasn't really changed. You can have the best controls in place, like you've mentioned here, but if someone still clicks on that malicious link that comes through an email or a text message, whatever, and enters their credentials, or even sometimes just clicking on the link that causes the compromise, like, how do you actually address stuff like that?
Yeah, the human element is huge. Security awareness training is critical, but it can't be a once-a-year video that everyone just clicks through, right? It needs to be ongoing, engaging, and relevant. So simulated phishing exercises can help identify who needs additional training. And you need to create a culture where people feel comfortable reporting suspicious activity without fear of being blamed, right? But beyond training, you really need technical controls that assume humans will make mistakes.
Sure.
Multi-factor authentication, email filtering, endpoint protection. These are all safety nets when someone does click on a phishing link. But even the best safety nets get tested. That's the fourth risk domain, is really the incident response and recovery. And I'd argue this is the one that most CFOs are the least prepared for. It's not if you'll have a security incident, it's when. Do you have an incident response plan? Have you tested it? Can you detect an intrusion quickly? Can you contain it? Can you recover your data if you're hit with ransomware?
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit then, ransomware specifically, because I think in this scenario that wouldn't terrify a CFO, right? You come in Monday morning and your systems are encrypted and there's a ransom demand. Like, what should organizations be doing to prepare for that worst case scenario?
Yeah. So ransomware preparedness has several layers, I would say. First is prevention, keeping keeping systems patched, having strong access controls, backing up data regularly. Next is detection. Can you identify ransomware activity early before it spreads? The last is containment. Can you isolate affected systems quickly? And then fourth is recovery. Can you restore from backups without paying the ransom? Many organizations will discover during a ransomware attack that their backups are either inadequate or have also been compromised. You need to test your backups regularly and keep offline backups that can't be encrypted by ransomware. You also need an incident response plan that includes decision-making frameworks. Under what circumstances would you consider paying a ransom? Who makes that decision? How do you communicate with stakeholders, regulators, and potentially law enforcement? These are decisions you do not want to be making for the first time at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday.
All right, let me raise the point then around data privacy, because I would imagine that's increasingly intertwined with the cybersecurity risk that we're talking about here, right? So we've got a number of regulations that are well known. You've got GDPR throughout the EU. You've got CCPA in California. Every state's got their own version of state privacy laws, and we're even talking about different federal privacy legislation potentially in the works here. So how should organizations be thinking through their data privacy risk?
Yeah, data privacy has gone from really a niche compliance issue to a genuine enterprise risk. And for CFOs, really that exposure is real. So GDPR fines alone can reach 4% of global revenue. Not insignificant, right? No. And the US regulatory patchwork, CCPA, states, federal legislation means you can't just solve for one jurisdiction and move on. And it's not just regulatory. Customer expectations have shifted as well. So people care about how their data is used, and breaches damage that trust in a way that outlasts even the headlines that you're referring to earlier. And this is why data privacy and cybersecurity are really deeply connected, is you can't protect data you don't know you have. Privacy programs really start with that data mapping, understanding what personal data you collect, where it's stored, how it's used, who has access, and not unimportant, how long do you keep it?
Yeah, so it comes back to knowing, like you said, what data you have and where it lives. But I think for a lot of organizations, especially those that probably have grown through acquisitions or have old legacy systems, that's easier said than done, like a lot of things in life. Right, data's everywhere. You got multiple systems, you got spreadsheets, emails, backups, you name it. So how do they actually get the visibility that you're talking about? It's
definitely challenging, and it really requires both technology and process. Data discovery tools can scan your systems to identify personal data. Data classification helps you understand what's sensitive versus just routine. And you need governance around data. So clear policies on data collection, retention schedules, and access controls. The good news is that the work that you do for privacy compliance also improves your cybersecurity posture. So when you know what data you have and where it lives, you can protect it better. When you implement access controls for privacy, you're also limiting your exposure if there's a breach. And one more thing, privacy risk doesn't stop at your own walls. If you share customer data with third parties, you're on the hook for how they protect it, which is a perfect bridge to what we need to talk about next.
Yeah, so you just made a point that I want to build on. So if you share customer data with third parties, you own that risk. And I think this is where a lot of organizations maybe have a blind spot that they're not aware of. So they've done the work internally, right?
Sure.
They've got all the right protocols and controls and processes in place, but their vendor ecosystem is a whole other exposure. So when we talk about third-party risk, what are we actually talking about? Because I think a lot of people maybe just assume it's just the cybersecurity element, but is it more?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the misconception. So third-party risk is much broader than just cybersecurity. Breaks down into really 4 distinct types, I would say. Okay. Operational risk. So if a critical vendor goes down, can your business keep running? So that's one area. Cybersecurity risk is certainly one. So if a vendor with access to your systems or data gets breached, that breach is effectively your breach, right?
Yep.
Compliance risk. So if a vendor violates regulations on your behalf, you can be held responsible. And reputational risk. If a vendor behaves unethically, that sticks to you too. SolarWinds attack is a perfect example of how a single vendor compromise can really cascade into thousands of organizations' problems overnight.
Yeah, and what makes this probably particularly challenging is that organizations have become increasingly dependent on those vendors for a lot of their critical functions, right? You're outsourcing IT infrastructure to cloud providers, customer data to all the different CRM systems that are in play. Payment processing is a big one that goes to third parties. And these vendors have access to probably some of your most sensitive data and critical systems. So the stakes, I think, are really high. So how does a organization manage around that complexity?
I mean, I think like everything, it starts with a risk-based approach, right? Not all vendors pose the same level of risk. A vendor with access to customer data or critical system access poses more risk than a vendor providing janitorial services. So first, categorize vendor by risk level. For high-risk vendors, you need robust due diligence before engaging them, financial due diligence. Are they financially stable? Security assessments. Do they have adequate cyber security controls? Compliance reviews. Are they meeting regulatory requirements? Reference checks. And increasingly, you need to understand vendors' own third-party risk management practices, not to chase it down the rabbit hole, but how do they manage their subcontractors? Because your vendor's vendor is your risk too.
Yeah, that definitely can get a bit of a web of increasing complexity. So due diligence happens up front, right? So, but the risk doesn't stop once you've signed that contract with that vendor, right? Things change. I imagine a vendor's security posture might deteriorate over time or have vulnerabilities that didn't exist when you first signed that contract. There might be acquired. So the vendor's relationship could change potentially. They might start using subcontractors like you mentioned that they didn't at first or something that you didn't even know they were doing. So how do you maintain oversight in an environment where things could change?
Yeah. And this is exactly where a lot of programs really can fall short. They do the upfront work and then treat the vendor as cleared. Third-party risk management is not a one-time exercise. It's continuous. You need ongoing monitoring. For high-risk vendors, that might include annual security assessments, quarterly business reviews, real-time monitoring of security ratings from third-party services that track vendor cyber risk, track vendor performance. Are they meeting SLAs? Do they have frequent outages or issues? Security incidents. You also need clear contractual protections. Your contract should include security requirements, audit rights, incident notification obligations, and liability provisions. If there's a breach at a vendor, you need to know it immediately, not weeks later when you read about it in the news.
Let me layer in the concept of concentration risk into this conversation, because I think this is an underappreciated aspect when we're talking about third-party risk. You know, if you're heavily dependent on a single vendor, or if many of your vendors are using the same underlying infrastructure, you're going to have some level of concentration risk that you need to address. You know, we saw this, I think, when AWS had an outage and huge portions of the internet went down, and we're scrambling around that whole that whole isolated incident. So how should organizations think about concentration risk for themselves?
Concentration risk is critical and often, all too often overlooked, right? So first, you really need visibility. Know your critical vendors, understand your dependencies. For each critical vendor, you need to ask yourself, what happens if they're unavailable for a day? How about a week? Permanently? Can you switch to an alternative? How long does that take? For truly critical vendors, you need to have contingency plans in place. That might mean maintaining relationships with backup vendors, designing your architecture so you're not locked into a single provider, or having offline backup capabilities. You also need to understand your vendors again. So if your cloud provider relies on a single data center provider, you have an indirect concentration risk, right? That's what we call fourth-party risk. And most organizations have almost no visibility into that.
Interesting.
You know your vendors, but do you know who your vendors depend on? That's the exposure that tends to surprise people.
All right. Not to make things overwhelming here, but how do organizations then actually operationalize this without dedicating a whole army of people or expensive team to manage vendors?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the answer is technology and risk-based prioritization. You can't do deep due diligence on every vendor. So focus resources on those high-risk vendors. For lower risk vendors, use automated tools, standardized questionnaires, lighter touch reviews. Third-party risk management platforms help with vendor inventory, risk assessment, monitoring, and reporting. These platforms can integrate with vendor security rating services, financial data sources, and news feeds for continuous monitoring. And there's another area where the integrated GRC approach from episode 2, I think, really matters. Third-party risk touches procurement, legal, IT, information security, compliance, and risk management. If those functions all work together rather than in silos, you're much more efficient and effective.
Yeah. Well said. So before we move on, I do want to touch on ESG and kind of third-party risk, because I think this is also an emerging issue that we hear about. So organizations are being held accountable not just for their own environmental and social practices, but they have to also think about it through the lens of their supply chains, right? So if your supply chain, for example, has labor violations or has had environmental failures or governance problems as a whole, this is your problem as well, not just theirs, like we've been talking about. So how is that changing third-party risk management?
Yeah, this is where it really gets fun, right? So sustainability and ESG is absolutely expanding the scope of third-party risk management.
Yep.
Organizations need to understand their supply chains, labor practices, you mentioned, environmental impact, ethics, and governance. So it's being driven by a lot of the regulations in the EU around supply chain, the EU due diligence directive specifically. Investor expectations, I think, are increasingly demanding in this space, as well, quite frankly, as customer demands, right? So I think there's this recognition that you're absorbing the risk of your vendors. And so those that have really clear guidelines around sustainability items have to ensure that their vendors are doing the same.
Right.
So what this means in practice is really that your vendor due diligence needs to include sustainability factors that are relevant and important to you. So you need to include those requirements in contracts, monitor and potentially adjust and audit those supplier practices to ensure that they're following your expectations. And lastly, you really need transparency. Can you report on your supply chain's ESG and sustainability performance? I think this is where it gets particularly challenging for organizations with particularly complex global supply chains. But the direction of travel is clear. Regulators, investors, and customers increasingly expect you to know what is happening in your supply chain and act on it. We didn't know really is no longer an acceptable answer.
Just another thing to think about, right?
That's right. Add it to the list.
All right, let's talk regulatory change. We kind of tiptoed into that a little bit in this last section as well, but because I think this is the thread that's running through everything we've really discussed today. And it feels like every time we turn around, there's a new regulation, whether it's certain AI requirements. You've talked about the privacy laws lately, cybersecurity, disclosure rules that the SEC put out not too long ago. You mentioned some of the ESG and sustainability reporting requirements and standards and things like that. So coming from multiple directions, if you will, whether it's federal, state, international. So it's fair to say that organizations have a whole lot to keep up with, right?
Yeah. So the pace is genuinely accelerating, and it's coming from multiple directions all at once. So let me walk through some of the major areas. Okay. On AI, the EU's AI Act is the most comprehensive framework we've seen. It takes a risk-based approach, prohibiting certain uses outright and imposing strict requirements on high-risk applications. In the US, we're further behind, but state-level regulation is moving quickly. And the SEC has issued guidance on AI use by investment advisors. AI hiring laws are emerging in several jurisdictions. The honest answer is this space will keep changing. So the goal isn't to nail down every requirement. It's to build governance flexible enough to continue to adapt as those regulations change.
Yeah, and what's challenging is that it's happening while the technology as well evolves so fast.
Absolutely.
Regulations are being written for, I would say, today's AI capabilities, but by the time they're implemented, who knows what that looks like, right? Technology is moving on faster than we can keep pace. So how do those organizations then stay compliant?
Yeah, I think it really is around that flexible governance framework rather than just checking compliance boxes, right? If your framework is principles-based and you focus on transparency, fairness, accountability, and human oversight, it's more adaptable to whatever those regulatory changes are trying to meet, rather than kind of trying to meet the specific requirements that quite frankly could change tomorrow.
Yep.
That's exactly why really the NIST frameworks for AI and cyber are valuable anchors. They're really designed to be durable even as the specifics evolve, if you will. So on cybersecurity specifically, the SEC now requires public companies to disclose material incidents within 4 business days. So that sounds really straightforward, right? Until you're in the middle of an incident trying to assess materiality under pressure. Right. Organizations need that incident response plan that can explicitly include the SEC reporting decision around who decides if it's material, with what information, and most importantly, within what time frame. Yeah, exactly. And that's on top of really sector-specific rules in financial services, healthcare, and critical infrastructure that layer additional requirements.
Yeah, and I would say that SEC rule reflects probably a broader shift in how regulators think about risk. If we really kind of step back and look at it, right? It's not just, did you have good controls, but what risks are you facing? And then really, how are you managing those risks as being the more important question. And I think more emphasis is on disclosure. We're seeing transparency, board oversight. I'm seeing this, both in climate risk. We talked about human capital, supply chain, like you mentioned, and regulators want to know about your risks and what you're doing with them.
Right. And that really ties into sustainability and climate disclosures. So the EU, for instance, has extensive sustainability reporting through CSRD. States like California have their own climate disclosure laws. Some of these rules are still working through legal challenges and through the legislative process, but that doesn't really change the direction of travel. So investors, customers, and regulators all want the same thing, which is to demonstrate that you understand your sustainability exposure and have a plan for it. On privacy specifically, I think the US landscape remains fragmented, I would say. So CCPA in California, you have comprehensive laws now in, I think, more than a dozen states at this point with varying requirements. For most organizations doing business nationally, the practical answer is to build your privacy program to the highest standard, right? Rather than trying to track each state's nuances separately. It's more work up front, but far less painful than managing a patchwork of state-by-state compliance.
So AI regulations, cyber disclosure, sustainability reporting, privacy laws, how do you operationalize staying on top of all that? Surely it's not just adding more heads to the team, right?
Yeah, headcount alone won't solve it. And frankly, neither will technology. It takes both, really kind of working in tandem. The first capability you need is regulatory change management, systematically monitoring developments, assessing their impact on your organization, and updating controls. So some organizations are going to build that in-house. Others will partner with legal regulatory intelligence providers. The second is integrated compliance management. So when a new rule lands, you need to quickly understand, what data does this touch? What controls do we need? How do we report? If your compliance functions are operating in silos, that assessment really can take months or longer, right? In some cases. With an integrated GRC approach, it's weeks. The third is flexible technology-enabled systems. So manual document-based compliance processes don't scale very well. GRC platforms, data management tools, automated reporting, these all let you respond faster and with less risk of those things falling through the cracks.
And there's a strategic element that we can't ignore
Absolutely.
here, right? Organizations that are ahead of regulatory curves have an inherent competitive advantage, right? If you think about it, if you've built that AI governance that we've been talking about before regulations even require it, you can then adopt AI faster than your competitors who might be then scrambling to just comply. So I think it's an important note to make, and being proactive about risk in general and compliance can actually just be a true business enabler.
Yeah, and I think that's the mindset shift we're really trying to help organizations make. So from compliance as a cost center to governance as a competitive asset. And I think that's really important as organizations move forward. So organizations with those mature risk frameworks really move faster precisely because they're not reinventing the wheel every time something changes. By the time a regulation is finalized, they've already been building towards it. The ones who wait until it's final are already a year behind.
Yeah. So before we close, I do want to come back to the interconnected nature of these risks. So AI, cybersecurity, we talked about third party, regulatory compliance. They're not separate issues, right? They overlap and amplify each other, I think is fair to say. So how should organizations think about managing these interconnected risks?
Yeah, and that's the whole point of kind of the interconnected GRC approach, right? It's why we spent 3 episodes on it to some degree. When these risks are managed in silos, you really miss the connections that matter most across your organization. Your AI governance team might not be talking to cybersecurity about the risks AI systems introduce, right? Third-party risk might not be coordinating with privacy about what data flows to vendors. Compliance might not understand how new regulations reshape your technology strategy. Each gap is really a blind spot. An integrated approach actually means coordinating those risk assessments, sharing information, and developing holistic strategies across the organization. And when evaluating a new AI tool, for instance, the discussion includes data privacy implications, cybersecurity requirements, third-party risk if it's a vendor solution, and regulatory compliance all at once, not sequentially. And your board reporting tells a connected story then, rather than a parade of separate updates that never quite add up to the full picture.
All right. So let's bring this series to a close if we can. So I do want to close with something you said earlier, I think, in the series. And I think that was that risk management is about enabling the business, not constraining it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the frame that really ties all 3 of our episodes that we've had together, right? The organizations that get AI governance, cybersecurity, again, I feel like I'm running through this list again, third-party risk, and that regulatory change right, aren't just protecting themselves. They're building the infrastructure to move faster, to move with more confidence than the organizations that don't. And that's the competitive case for taking this seriously. So if you're thinking about how to strengthen your GRC capabilities, we'd obviously love to help. I know at Embark, we work with organizations to assess their risk posture across these areas that we've talked about, to help build those governance frameworks that we've been highlighting. And even implement that integrated risk management approach. And so you can obviously connect with us on LinkedIn. I know Allison would love to carry on the conversation and just hear about all the things that you have on your plate or on your roadmap and take it from there. Allison, so 3 episodes in, can't thank you enough. You've made this genuinely useful for people, and that's not easy to do, I think, with material as complex as a lot of the stuff we talked about.
Thanks, Adam. So these conversations really matter, right? And I hope listeners walk away with something that they can use.
And we can't end this series without obviously thanking our listeners. We hope you did find this 3-part series useful. And until next time, this is Accounting Matters.